this disparity, a scenario where the pain of this episode is not shared by all of those who were involved in it. And I think that is very disturbing to many people. You have individuals who are learning the hard lessons of the crisis in Main Street, but meanwhile, Wall Street and Washington are thriving. So I receive these really searing and bewildering messages in my email box regularly with questions like the following. Why are banks being allowed to force troubled borrowers from their homes without proving that they have the right to do so? This is a problem that we've seen over and over in the foreclosure arena when banks file misleading or absolutely incorrect filings with the courts in allowing them to foreclose. Why are the regulators in Washington, the same people, some of them, who failed so utterly to rein in the reckless lending practices while they were going on, why are these people somehow now rewarded with even greater power and even more responsibility? Why are some of the very people who were on the scene of this particular crime in positions of even greater power now? Others wonder why no government agency or law enforcement group has really tried very hard to recover some of the many millions of dollars in compensation given to the heads of companies that later failed or required bailout money. The protesters in Zuccotti Park in Lower Manhattan have focused their ire on bankers and CEOs. This is not surprising, given the trouble that the bankers wrought on our society and the riches that they pocketed during both the boom and the bust. But I think it's only a matter of time before Occupy Wall Street finds a focus that is also in Washington. Because that, to me, is where the decisions have been made to close investigations into prominent mortgage lenders without bringing any charges. The accountability that so many people are clamoring for should begin in Washington, whether either financial regulators or criminal prosecutors. I think it's very dangerous to have a society where we do not hold central figures accountable for actions that contributed to such a devastating crisis. A system where perpetrators of such a crime are allowed to slink away from the scene, I believe, is a recipe for anarchy and chaos. And yet, so many of the people who contributed to the mess are still in positions of power or have risen to an even higher rank. Some of the architects of the crisis are not commanding center stage any longer, but they too remain respected members of the community, whether it be the business community or the regulatory community. That's why my co-author, Josh Rosner, and I wanted to write Reckless Endangerment. Because even when we sat down in late 2008 and 2009, we were angry by the fact that this crisis had been created by a crowd of self-interested, politically influential, and arrogant people. And we had no idea that they would not have been brought to justice by now, but they haven't. We also felt that it was important to describe how this credit crisis came about so that the world would not have to go through anything like it again. So Reckless Endangerment, which I hope you'll enjoy, although it's difficult to enjoy, was different from the raft of other books that were written about the crisis early on. Some of them, written by colleagues of mine, were really just sort of day-to-day what went on, who said what to whom, without providing much analysis. Those are very helpful to getting a grounding in the crisis, but what we really wanted to provide was names, ranks, and serial numbers of the folks who were deeply involved. There were other books who were sort of the mind that this was an act of God, or because it was so many people's fault, it was really nobody's fault. I objected to that also. Josh and I felt differently about this act of God idea. This was not a force majeure. This was not a tsunami. This was a crisis that arose out of the acts of men and women, some of them with good societal goals, and some with agendas that were very personal and very financially oriented. But we wanted to outline both the sins of omission that helped fuel this crisis and the sins of commission. So in the end, we felt that analyzing the financial crisis, its origins, and its framers required identifying powerful participants who would rather not be named. And it required connecting dots going back in time that appeared unrelated at the time, but really were meaningful to the crisis and contributing to it, integral to its outcome. It meant shedding light on the dark corners of Wall Street and Washington. Hidden in these shadows were people and places and incidents that help us understand the nature of this disaster, and we hope can keep us from encountering such a thing again. And yet other investigations have not been forthcoming, as I said at the outset. And this is feeding the abundant anger and mistrust that is really roiling our country. Is it really that difficult to hold perpetrators of this disaster responsible? Or is there something perhaps more pernicious at work? Maybe a concerted effort to protect some of the primary participants from prosecution. This is not an idle question. One might well argue whether the government, the United States government, really wants to identify who did what during this episode. With regulators such as the Federal Reserve, the Office of Thrift Supervision, the Controller of the Currency, and the Securities and Exchange Commission so deeply involved in the bad practices leading up to the crisis, because they let them absolutely go wild, you have to wonder whether or not hard-nosed government investigators wouldn't easily wind up probing themselves. It's my belief that many in Washington know that if a full-blown investigation of this meltdown were launched, the spotlight could very soon fall on them. There's another important factor that appears to be at work in limiting the number of prosecutions that we've seen in the United States. And that was the contention by some of the people at the highest levels of government that in-depth investigations of wrongdoing during the mania could undermine the stability of the financial system. This approach dominated during the fall of 2008 when world markets shuddered. And it may have contributed to a crucial slowdown in investigations then that has led us to where we are today. One example of this occurred in October of 2008, just about now, when Tim Geithner, then the head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, took a meeting with Andrew Cuomo, who was the Attorney General of the state of New York at the time. At the Fed, which oversees the nation's largest banks, Mr. Geithner worked with Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson on TARP, the big bailout fund for banks. Mr. Geithner also led efforts to shore up the American International Group, the large insurer who had made some disastrous bets insuring mortgage securities. Mr. Geithner's focus in all of these efforts, and others that we're not aware of, was to stabilize world financial markets. So back to the meeting in mid-October of 2008. Geithner shows up at Mr. Cuomo's door. Mr. Cuomo had been gaining a reputation as something of a sheriff of Wall Street. He had been questioning banks and the ratings agencies aggressively for more than a year about their roles in the growing debacle. And he was also investigating the granting of rich bonuses to the executives at AIG. Now, these two men had known each other for a very long time. They had worked together in the Clinton administration. But Mr. Cuomo was seemingly eager to get some answers to his probes. At the time of the meeting, though, Mr. Geithner expressed concern to him that perhaps his investigations could make the system unstable. We needed to shore up the financial system. The investigations were best to wait. Now, this is perhaps the right thing to do at that time. But if it has, in fact, as some people believe, led to the place we are now, which is where no one has been prosecuted, then that is a question well worth asking. The problem, of course, is that a great deal of trust has been squandered by both private institutions in America and by public institutions. The credit crisis was, after all, a double failure. First was the failure of the private sector to rein itself in, to limit itself to appropriate business practices. The profits from the reckless activities, we would argue, were just too tantalizing to pass up for many of the executives running these institutions. But second was the abysmal regulatory performance, the failure by people at the highest levels of the United States regulatory system to even understand the risky practices that were being pursued was nothing short of breathtaking. This inability to recognize peril when it was staring them in the face meant that Ben Bernanke, Tim Geithner, Hank Paulson were all far behind when the subprime crisis began to metastasize. The question that remains to be answered, and it will be tackled by ethicists and others far more qualified than I, is why did greed and bad behavior go so viral during this period? I would argue that part of an explanation lies in a rejection by some business leaders of that very powerful social compact that was a duty to others rather than just to self. This was once, I believe, embraced by business leaders, people in positions of power who recognized that they held immense sway over investors, workers, over their suppliers, their investors, obviously, their customers. They had agreed to hold themselves to a higher standard of care. Maybe it was an unwritten rule, certainly, but it seems to have been supplanted by the notion that personal profits are supreme and that making it to the top means having the biggest bank account. I don't know how we recover this attention to duty. I don't know how to force people in high places to forego profits for propriety. I know that those of us in the media can do our part by shining the light on dark corners where such behavior often flourishes. But faced with so many woeful stories of the people harmed by the credit boom and bust, it is difficult right now to be optimistic about the future. One way, I think, to regain confidence after enduring this mess is to have some of these people be held accountable. Investors, pensioners, employees, and taxpayers all have been hurt by the reckless risk-taking at the highest levels of some of these companies. And it will be beyond exasperating if the people who created this disaster and profited mightily from it are allowed to slip from the scene. Then we will have confirmed the suspicion that the paths of the powerful are protected, that the little guy is left to fend for himself. I'd like to close before the question and answer period with a quote from Frédéric Bastiat, a French economist and journalist who lived in the first half of the 19th century. This is what he said: "When plunder becomes a way of life for a group of men living together in society, they create for themselves in the course of time a legal system that authorizes it and a moral code that glorifies it." End quote. This plunder is what we are all up against. This plunder is what the Occupy Wall Street crowd is protesting. This plunder cannot be allowed to prevail.